Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. Where are you, Tim? There you are, yep. So Dr. Timothy Finney was too modest to give us a detailed bio listing his many qualifications and achievements. So we just got this from Tim. He says, "I have a checkered history, just a suburban boy who did physics badly," he says, "radiation, patent examining, youth working, and Bible. Too much examining and not enough doing," he says. I'm not sure that's true, but however, we did track down his CV, which reveals that Tim has degrees in physics, computer studies, divinity, and a PhD on the text of Hebrews. He has lectured at WA theological colleges. He has also worked in IT, in data science, in health physics, and New Testament textual research. He's made a number of academic conference presentations and currently works in radiation, which maybe he'll tell us more about that when he steps up. So I think we're in for a very interesting session. Over to you, Tim, and welcome you up to the front. Thank you. Thank you.
Can you all hear me? Am I too close? It's good to see a lot of friends here, familiar faces, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. And tonight I'm going to be talking about the text of Hebrews. So my first job was as a technician working at the state X-ray labs. And that's because I did a physics degree, and that's how I got into radiation. And then I've done a lot of other things, and now I'm doing radiation again. So it pays the bills. I like computing better, but now you can ask ChatGPT to write your program, so might be good. It's really good to see people I've known since I was a child. It's wonderful. And God is everywhere, even in Western Australia. And even in Perth and South Perth. Well, now let's talk about the text of Hebrews. So the book of Hebrews is an interesting book that you've probably heard about. Now, the first time I gave this talk was at a theological college, and they'd been learning about Hebrews. And so I said, "You've been learning about the book of Hebrews, or Hebrews, to the Hebrews, which is what it's called, because they used to write titles on the tops of the books. So who wrote it? Anyone got a pet theory about who wrote Hebrews? Thank you. Yes. Yes. That's a good answer. So there was a human involved, though. Good question. Was it Paul? So Origin, 220 AD, said only God knows who wrote Hebrews. He said it's Paul's thoughts, but not his style. So Origen did not think that Paul wrote Hebrews. And Origen was like a prodigy back then. A lot of the world, when they found out that Origen believed the gospel, thought, well, it must be right. He was a bit like a Stephen Hawking of his age. Anyway, what's it about? What's the book of Hebrews about? What was that? It is about Jesus, the great high priest. It's the only book that talks about the high priesthood of Jesus. And who was it written to? Yes, to the Hebrews. Where were they? And when was it written? See, all of these questions no one's got a good answer to. And why was it written? To teach, and maybe to avoid an error that the people it was written to were falling into. Anyway, it's a very interesting book. So we're going to talk about what did the author of Hebrews write? And that's a funny question to ask because we've got it, haven't we? Well, we've got an English translation of what was written in Greek. And if you look at your Bible, every now and then you'll see a footnote that says some manuscripts have, and then it'll have something else. For example, at Hebrews chapter 2, verse 9, most of the manuscripts, which are the hand copies that people wrote because they didn't have printing in those days, not up until 1450 did Europe get mechanised printing. And before that, it was all hand copying, from when it was first written down to the age of printing. And tonight we're going to do a copying exercise, and we'll start in a little while. And your job is to get your own copy of the beginning of Hebrews, copied from the original, which is sitting over there, by the end of the night. And I've chosen the first four verses of the book of Hebrews, and I've chosen the King James version of it because the language is a bit archaic, as the Greek of Hebrews would have been a bit archaic after a few hundred years of copying. So you're free to make the language more comprehensible when you make your own copy, but try not to change its meaning. So please, Martin has the original. So Martin will start. As soon as Martin's made a copy, he can use his copy, give it to someone else to produce your own copy. And the idea is that by the end of tonight, you'll all have your own copy. And you don't have to rush, there's plenty of time. And if you've got a photographic memory, just forget that slide. All right. So copies were made originally onto papyrus, which is a plant. And it used to grow at Curtin University, but they pulled it all up. I'm still a bit displeased about that. And it was growing in Jack Finney Lake. But then, because they thought, we've got to return it to its original state, they let the water drain out. What they don't know is it was called Jack Finney Lake because Jack Finney made it. With a bulldozer. He didn't drive it, but... Anyway, they pulled the papyrus out. There are a few places where it grows, and it loves it in Perth. And they used to have to make their own ink out of carbon, which they got out of lamps. And so it was the soot out of lamps, and they'd mix it up. You can still buy it in some places in the world, carbon ink. So they'd write without spaces between words, so Martin is suffering with that. And all capitals, no spaces, no punctuation, well, maybe a little bit. The ink, what they wrote on, the lettering and other details changed with time. But it was done by hand throughout. So manuscript means written by hand. Mechanical printing came in about 1450, but the first Greek New Testament was not printed until 1516, which is way later than the other classics. It got kind of forgotten, but Erasmus in 1516 produced the first printed copy of the Greek New Testament. He wasn't first, Cardinal Jimenez was first, but he had to get it approved by the Pope. And while it was being approved, Erasmus beat him by grabbing some manuscripts from the local university, giving them to a printer called Froben and saying, print that. So Erasmus said it wasn't so much as edited as thrown together, the first copy of the Greek New Testament. So all of that time, you would have to make your own copy. But the thing is, most of you wouldn't have been able to read because literacy rates throughout the Middle Ages were about 10%. So there was usually a reader in a church because only 1 in 10 could read, and it was an important job. So there's a picture of someone. That's from Herculaneum next door to Vesuvius. It's a wall fresco, and it's someone holding a papyrus roll. We all say scroll, but they call them rolls because they were rolled up. And to find your place, you'd have to roll a lot because these things were about 10 metres long. And that was a standard size for a roll. The reason that there's Luke and Acts is because it was too long to fit on one roll. Needed two. So if you couldn't make a copy, you'd have to get a scribe, either a volunteer, such as a reader in a church, or someone who was paid, and you could get paid a couple of chickens a day for copying. That was the going rate, or a shirt. And you had to get a manuscript to copy. So where would you grab a manuscript from? Probably the church down the road. But there's no reason it couldn't have come from the other side of the empire. And the aim was to make an accurate copy, which is what Martin's trying to do, and you'll all try to do tonight. So there's some scribes. This is around about the time of the First World War, and it's people at the tomb of Ezekiel in Iraq. And so that's what scribes look like. Not all manuscripts survived. Some wore out, some were thrown away, some were buried, some were reused for other texts. They're called palimpsests, which is Greek for written again. So it might seem surprising that they would use copies of the scriptures and wash the scriptures off and rewrite something else on top. But they used to do that. Fortunately for us, because we've got some really old copies of the New Testament that are hidden underneath a copy of something else, and they may well not have survived if they didn't have the something else there. My guess is that of the pre-300, round about Constantine's time, of the pre-300 manuscripts, my guess is, and it's just a guess, only about 1 in 1,000 has survived. Could be 1 in 10,000. So one cause of loss was intentional destruction of the scriptures. So many persecutions were directed against Christians at various locations and at various times. So if you read church history by Eusebius, about 2/3 of it is devoted to the persecutions that Christianity suffered. It's a big emphasis of his book on church history, which was written around about the time of Constantine, who, as you know, made Christianity legal. And so the persecutions pretty much stopped at that time. So the first Roman emperor persecuted Christians. That's when it started. So he chopped off Peter's head and Paul's head, blamed the fire of Rome on the Christians. So they must have been a thing in 65 AD when that happened. For the emperor to have known about them so that he could blame them because he was getting a bit of heat, because he ended up burning down a third of the city or something because he wanted to redesign it. So there were other bad persecutions under Marcus Aurelius, about 180, and Decius, 250, Valerian, 255. And the worst of all was under Diocletian, 300, round about 300. And it only finished in 312 when Constantine issued the Edict of Toleration. And guess what? Constantine's mother was a Christian. So she said, "Constantine, stop it." So Eusebius talks a lot, but there's also the Passion of the Skeleton Martyrs. We know the exact date of their trial. It was July the 17th, 180. And one of the Christians on trial that day was carrying a copy of Paul's letters because the Roman high-up who was conducting the trial said, "What's that in your satchel?" And he said, "It's a copy of the writings of a just man named Paul." So here are some examples of manuscripts of Hebrews that have survived until today, and people write MSS instead of manuscripts for shorthand. So New Testament manuscripts are known by various names. They've all been assigned standard identifiers like P13 or 01, pretty unimaginative, 1739. Depending on what they were written on. So if they were written on papyrus, they get a P and a number. And if they're written with uppercase letters or uncials, which is another name for them, or majuscule, large letters, then they'll get a number like 01, 02, 03. And if they're written in cursive, running writing, then they get the name minuscules. And the vast majority of the manuscripts are minuscules. And they were written after about the 8th century. That's when the handwriting style changed from the uppercase to the running writing. So dating manuscripts is done by handwriting style. And you might think that's pretty unscientific. But it's not bad, and when they do carbon dating, usually they get the same answer. But the thing is that these are some of the most highly treasured cultural icons that we have, and no one wants to burn them, so you can do carbon dating on them. So there's P13. It's actually not black and white, just that picture is. And I've held P13 in my hands. In glass, looks like an old bit of cardboard, and it's about 300 AD. So it was dug up by Grenfell and Hunt at Oxyrhynchus in Egypt about 1900. And they dated it as first half of the 4th century. It's unusual for a Christian manuscript because it's written on a roll instead of a codex. A codex is a book form, and Christians were without doubt the first group to use the book form. Everyone else was using rolls up until that point. So it was a Christian innovation to use the book form. So P13 is unusual because it's a Christian copy of the scriptures that is not a codex. It's very unusual. But it's copied onto the back of a new Epitome of Livy, which is a condensed history of Rome. And I've got a question, which is, does that say anything about who owns the manuscript? So it was found in Egypt, and it's a history of Rome. And it's dated about 300, which is about the time when the persecution was real bad. I don't know. Could have been, yes, and probably a reasonably high up one who could write. So there's a page number, so they'd use letters for numbers at the top. And don't worry about trying to recognise any of the text. That was actually a piece of Hebrews in that picture that you saw before. So at the top in the middle is an M and a Z, and that's a page number. Yes, next slide. That's P46, Papyrus 46. That one was found somewhere in Egypt because the people who find them are very cagey about where they found them, which church they stole them from usually, which tomb they raided. Anyway, they've all been found pretty much now. It's unusual for them to find any more. You can see a page number at the top of that, and you might be able to see about, well, the first line is the last line of the book before, which was Romans in this case. So this manuscript went Romans, Hebrews, because the books were in order of length in this copy. And you might see about 3 lines down, there's a few letters over on the right, and it's S, sigma, tau, I, and then a squiggle. And that's stikoi, which means number of lines, and the squiggle is a number that means 1,000. That means that the scribe has written down how many lines he's copied because that's how he gets paid. But just below that is Pros Hebreus, which is the title of the book of Hebrews. So this one's variously dated somewhere between 200 and 300 AD, again by the handwriting. And if your eyes are good enough, you'll see that there's a correction. It's above the line, on the second line down at the end of the line. So Hebrews begins at many times and in many ways God spoke to our fathers, or to the fathers, but that is adding in our fathers because it's to the Hebrews. So it makes sense to put our fathers in. That's a textual variant. So when you see one of them, you think, well, what is the text? Yes, I've talked enough about that. There's Codex Sinaiticus. So all of these copies, all of these manuscripts have a life of their own. They all have a personality, and you come to love them as you work with them. And there's Codex Sinaiticus. It's a work of art. Some people think this might be one of the 50 Bibles that Constantine ordered for his new capital, Constantinople, which is now called Istanbul. So when he made Christianity legal, He converted. And he said, I want 50 copies of the Bible, and he got Eusebius, the one who wrote the church history, to do it. But Eusebius was in Caesarea, where Haifa, near in Israel now, a bit south of Haifa. And so he said, give me 50 copies of the Bible, which Eusebius did. And it's a massive undertaking. So it cost 700 goats their skins to make Codex Sinaiticus. Big production. I don't know what it would cost these days because someone had to copy everything, and this is calligraphic writing. Next, please. So there's Codex Alexandrinus, named after the place where they think it came from, dated around about 450 AD. Next, please. Codex Vaticanus. Good question. No, it's very unusual for you to have a complete text, but Sinaiticus, Vaticanus and Alexandrinus are the entire Bible. That's called a pandect. So normally you would get the Gospels or Paul's letters or the everything else, and then Revelation was quite often left out. Wasn't that common that it was included, especially in the Greek East. So it's unusual for you to have an entire Bible. And so yes, if I'll just talk a bit about Vaticanus. So you might be able to see some scribble. That thing that looks like a gateway, that big black gateway, is the first letter of the book, P. P as in pi. And it's been coloured in badly because this has been retouched in about 1200 because this was given as a gift to someone, and they redid all of the ink. And you can see some writing about a third of the way or half of the way down that column below the P, that big black P. That says, "You naughty scribe." It actually says, "foolish and bad." Methestate kai kake, aphes palaion, me metapoie. Leave the old reading alone. Don't change it. So that's another scribe having a go at this guy for changing phaneron to pharon. And it's to do with Jesus being the outshining of God's glory. And there is a textual variant there. And there's also a scribe saying, leave it alone, don't change it. And it's an old reading. So, yes. So Ephraemi Rescriptus, that one has suffered, that manuscript, because that's a palimpsest. It had Ephraim's writings. Ephraim was a wonderful 4th century Syrian bishop, and his writings are very well loved. And so someone wrote his sermons on top of an old copy of the book of Hebrews. And you can see there's kind of smudge marks all over the place. That's because someone poured a chemical onto it to try and make the old writing come out. And then someone called Tischendorf got hold of this and managed to decipher what was underneath without scientific aids. He was a real prodigy, Tischendorf. He's the one who found Sinaiticus at St. Catherine's Monastery. The monks knew about it. But he said, can I borrow this? And so the monks are still mad about that because it's now sitting in the British Museum. And it was purchased from the Russian government because Stalin said, I don't want this old Bible. And it was half government money and half public money. So the people of the United Kingdom raised money to buy that thing. And it was a huge amount of money that they bought it for back then. Yeah, anyway, so Tischendorf, who discovered who managed to get Sinaiticus off the monks in St. Catherine's, is also the one who managed to decipher this. Next slide, please. So this is Claromontanus. That's the Greek side, and it's beautiful, isn't it? And that's the Latin side. So this is a diglot. It's Greek and Latin, side by side. So you can, if you can read Greek or Latin, you can read that. And that's the beginning of Hebrews in those two. Next, please. Minuscule. There's a minuscule. Now, this one is 1739, very unimaginative name, but it's got all around the biblical text commentary, and it's all commentary by very ancient writers. So this, even though it's minuscule, looks like it's a copy of a very early text. And it's got a sentence at the end. Not sure if it's Hebrews or the end of Paul's writings, where they used to include Hebrews, that says this was made from a very ancient copy by Pamphilus, I think, who set up a library in Caesarea early on that Origen studied at. So it goes way back. Next, please. So that's minuscule 2815. That's one of the manuscripts that Erasmus grabbed when he was making his printed Greek New Testament. And all that scrawl around the black writing is me, because I had to decipher that as part of my PhD work. And so that's me attempting to decode the scribal shorthand that is all over the place, where they contract strings of letters into a squiggle.
Not on the original, though.
It's the text, but it's shorthand. So, yeah. Polymeros. So that K, which is a K, that's actually kappa alpha iota, chi, and. So that's a bit of scribal contraction, because everyone knew, it's like when we write an and squiggle. So that's an and squiggle, but a Greek one. Palutropos, palai, hot theos, and that's the nomina sacra, so they wouldn't write the God, Jesus, Spirit, and a lot of other words that would that were commonly used in Christian writing. They'd write the first letter and the last letter and put a line across the top. It's called a nomina sacra, a sacred name. So that's shorthand for God. And then lalesas tois patrasin, which has got a contraction in it as well, because patrasin, fathers, that's a sacred name. Yeah, so lots of shorthand and contractions. So they're not writing the whole words out, just bits of it. And there is Erasmus's version. And if you looked at the other one that you just saw, next to that one, you'd see that they look very similar because they carved out the wooden blocks as the scribal contractions. And they've got all of that shorthand in there as well. But it's not contractions, it's the Greek written out, but they're still using the merged letters. So a sigma and a tau and an iota all become one there's a word for it. You know, when you merge two letters into one in printing. No, there's another word for it. I forgot what it is. It is a digraph, but there's another word, which you'd all know when you heard it. Next. So I did a lot of research and looked at those manuscripts for my honours dissertation, thesis, and then did a PhD where I got all of the pre-1000 AD manuscripts of Hebrews and typed them all into the computer using Roman letters for Greek letters because it was before the days of Unicode and all of that. And then wrote programs to compare all the texts with each other. And that took me all over the place to go and see the manuscripts. So British Museum, I saw a few things there. I went to Athens, saw some manuscripts there, and a lot of time at the Institute for New Testament Textual Research in Germany. So once the transcriptions were finished, that's typing in the Greek letters as Roman letters, and that took about 10 years, and half time, like not full time. I wrote programs to collate the text word by word, which means line them all up against each other to see where there are differences. And a friend told me about software that biologists had developed to analyse relationships among species based on observational data, and I regard that as serendipity. It was a Christian friend, said, and doing biology at UWA, there's this program, and it was by someone in Hungary. And he had written some Mac programs, Martin, and I was using my toaster. And I'd been thinking there must be a way to visualise how these manuscripts all compare with each other spatially. I couldn't think of it. But my friend said, there might be something for that. So I put the data from my collation programs into this, and what came out? How many variations? So Hebrews has got about 5,000 words, and the 30 manuscripts that I looked at had about 2,100 variations. Is that a bit of a shock? So 2 out of 5 words. But the vast majority of that is what's called orthographic, which means the way they write, but it's not affecting the meaning. So it's things like spelling and punctuation. It's got no effect on the meaning. But there are about 300 variations out of the 5,000 where it does make a difference. Again, most of them don't matter much. Might be a change of word order that usually doesn't make much difference in Greek. Or saying the same thing a different way, maybe putting a different word in. But every now and then you get one where it does make a difference, like Hebrews 2:9, where the difference is between that Jesus suffered on behalf of all, and then there's a textual variation that says, by the grace of God, or apart from God. And we all think, that's the desolation, the cry of desolation on the cross. No, it actually lines up with something that's in one of Paul's letters, that said God didn't need anyone to make a sacrifice for him because he hasn't sinned. So the apart from God is that Jesus suffered on behalf of all except God. So when you get something like that, how do you decide what the initial reading is? And people have been doing this since Origen's time. He was asking the question. And we come up with about 12 principles. Like the shorter reading is quite often better, but I don't like that because someone did a study and found out that the long reading's usually better. Because it's easy to make a scribal mistake where you shrink the text because you've left bits out. And we see that happen lots, probably happened tonight. Now, sometimes when I do this copying exercise, I used to do this a lot more, people are a bit more safety conscious these days, and I'd set fire to one of them and say, "Who am I? Who am I?" Right. Because that's what they used to do. Or I'd get another one and pour water on it. What happened to that? It got wet. You know, water and writing are not a good combination, or it goes mouldy and rotten and you have to chuck it away. So most of those manuscripts that you saw, the papyrus ones, came from rubbish tips in Oxyrhynchus, where Grenfell and Hunt went around about 1900. And they chose Oxyrhynchus because they thought they would find Christian writings there. It was the Egypt Exploration Fund and the Egypt Exploration Society that did that work. And they chose well because first day they found a copy of Matthew. So there's 12 principles. A good one is which reading best explains the others. So if you've got a number of options, you think, which one did the others come from? And there's nothing scientific about that. The 12 principles, like something that sounds unusual, but when you look at it, it sounds like what the author would have written. That's one of them. What is like this author? Anyway, there's a number of others. But none of them are guaranteed. So one thing I found out when we're talking about accuracy is that our Greek New Testament, with the critical apparatus that lists all of the variations, so the text is here, and then there's about that much again which is listing all of the variations, is completely accurate. And I did it by looking at Hebrews. I didn't do the whole New Testament because I'd still be at it. It's beyond one person. The only thing I found where they were wrong was that in P46 they listed P46 as having priest instead of high priest. But it turns out the people in Germany already knew. They just hadn't published the new edition yet. So what I found out is that our Greek New Testaments are entirely accurate and list all of the variation as it is. This is something that other religions may not do. For example, you've heard of the martyrs in Islam who are told that there will be virgins waiting for them. There's a textual variant in the Quran, but that is entirely suppressed to the point where the photographic evidence of it is suppressed. It's sitting in Germany, but no one's allowed to look at it these days. It's too much of a powder keg. No one wants to take that lid off. But the textual variant is bunches of grapes instead of virgins. See, the thing is, when you look at the manuscripts, this happens all the time. And it's good to know that in Christianity, we say so. That there is textual variation. And in fact, I know that when you have copied, you've got it wrong. Have you all got a copy yet? Right, so you've got your orthographic side and you've got your substantive side. So orthographic is just the spelling variations that don't matter much, and the substantive side is where it makes a difference to the meaning, even if it's so subtle you can't translate it into English. You know, if you translate it, you'll get the same English. So that's what you get when you put it through some analysis software. You get a picture and you think, what are those axes? They're directions of maximum variation. And so each one of those letters is a manuscript. And you can see they're not all exactly in the same place. That means they're not all exactly the same place. They're not all exactly the same text. And that is the substantive variation, the variations that make a difference in meaning. So if you put the next one up, that's the orthographic one. Now, I've stared at these things for a long time, and I can tell you that most of these manuscripts have the same kind of relationship to each other in the two pictures. But there's a couple that shift from one camp to another. That's because they've got one sort of text and another sort of spelling. And so, next picture, please. So, does spelling indicate provenance? So, another way to put this is, can you hear the scribe's accents in what they've copied? Because they used to spell the way they spoke. Anyway, perhaps that kind of spelling picture is a clue to where a manuscript was copied. So next, so more data is better, so I ended up putting all of the pre-1000 AD texts in. And next picture, please. You get a picture like that. And this is actually a rotating cube to show you the three-dimensionality of it. And as you can see, there are some places where there seems to be more text than others. Next slide, please. This is another way to look at it. So you can see some places where there seem to be bunches of texts. And this is like a tree, a family tree of all the manuscripts, but the problem is no one knows where they're all coming from. It's very hard to work that out. The biologists have the same problem. And it's controversial. Next picture, please. Conclusion. So the ancients like to ask three questions. What do you think? So you say, oh, I think blah, blah, blah. And then they say, why do you think so? And that's a hard question. That's where they'll go, yeah, but what about this? Did you think of that? And then the last question is, what difference does it make? That's a really good question to ask, especially if you spend 10 years on something. And the answer is not much difference at all. So after doing all this research, here's what I think. The New Testament is authentic. Authentic because it's got spelling variations. Authentic because it's got textual variations. That's what happens when human beings copy a text. That is authentic. And reliable, because we've got so many copies of the New Testament. Way, way, way more than any other writing from the ancient world. By a factor of hundreds, if not thousands. We've got more. And you could say, oh, well, they're all late copies of a bad text. Well, you can say that about any text from the ancient world. But the one that's got the best evidence is the New Testament. Spelling distribution information that you saw, that was a surprise. You can't fake that kind of stuff. That's in the data, waiting for someone to see it one day. And there it was, jumped out. And it means that this is the real thing, because you can associate that picture with a map of the Mediterranean. There's Egypt. There's the Holy Land. There's Asia Minor, where all the early Christian growth happened. There's the West, Rome. And you see it in the picture, the three-dimensional picture. You can see that distribution in the spelling side and in the textual variation side. So why do I think so? Because I spent a lot of time looking at it. And I was impressed with holding P13 in my hands and seeing this is the same text as I've got in my Greek New Testament, with the occasional variation. So the big question is, what difference does it make to the meaning of the text? And the answer is basically none. So we've got a good, reliable text, and as reliable as any other text from the ancient world by far, and as reliable and by far better. So I took a deep dive and found that the sources are genuine and trustworthy, because I looked at the manuscripts. And what difference does it make? Not much. I've no doubt that what we have today is substantially the same as what they wrote down way back then. And that's the end. But I'll just show you what the class that I first did this talk for did. Can you see the mistake they made? Sorry? One time I did this and someone changed it to God who at Sunday times and turned the he into she, which is fine. Yes, but they've actually created a piece of heresy here, the theological students, whom he had by himself passed over sin. And the word's purged, but someone couldn't read what someone else had written and so fixed it. And this is exactly what happens when scribes copy. It's happening in Greek, but it's exactly the same thing. That when they come across an error, they will do their best to fix it. So that's the end. I can take questions. I was bitten by the manuscripts. And I had a good PhD supervisor in Richard Moore.
Hebrews.
And I had good technology and good technological help, Martin. Thank you very much. Martin got me onto the Mac, which is what made it all possible, because they were way ahead of the pack in terms of being able to do this kind of stuff. So thank you, Martin.
Did you concentrate your studies in Hebrews or other scriptures in addition?
Sorry, what was...
So did you focus only on Hebrews, or did you do some of the other books as well?
I did focus on Hebrews, and then when I finished the PhD, I was waiting for people to notice it, and that never happened. And I thought, I've got to get this out there. So then I started... The problem is the analysis side, that people who do biblical studies aren't very good at doing statistical analysis. So it was a bit of an interdisciplinary no-go zone. And so I thought, if only people could more easily do the analysis than having to get an obscure set of programs from someone in Hungary, if I could make it more straightforward. So I spent a long time doing that. I started in about 2000, and it took about 10 years, and then released that, and no one took notice of it again. But what I did was I looked at the Gospel of Mark, because the theory of the development of the text for a long time has thought that there are textual families like the Alexandrian text, the Western text, and the Byzantine text, and another group called the Caesarean text. So I switched into the Gospel of Mark because the Caesarean text apparently was very clear in that. So I have gone wider, not looking at the individual manuscripts, but just looking at the critical apparatus in the Greek New Testament and getting that data into the machine so that I can analyse it. So I've made a suite of programs in R. So if any of you want to, you can just go to my GitHub page and download it, and it just goes. And the data's there as well. You can fiddle with it and do the analysis and get those three-dimensional pictures and the things that look like spiders' webs coming out, and tree diagrams and non-negative matrix factorisation and so on. Yes?
So I was wondering, when you were saying about some of the text being people doing words over, that sort of thing, to putting stuff over them when they're being put appropriate, when they're being burnt toast, get it rid of. Could they have done that in a way to actually to preserve them, so that when people looked at them, they didn't know they were actually looking at a piece of scripture, but thought they were looking at something completely different, and then thought, well, I'm going to keep this because it's not scripture. I'm not going to burn it. But had they have done that, they knew they would have lost it. Yeah. So those nomina sacra, which is so, for example, Jesus, you'd just write J, which is the first letter, and S, which is the last letter, and you'd put a line over it. But back then, that's how you wrote numbers. So if you saw a text that was a Christian scripture, it'd become blah, 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 and it'd have numbers in it. So someone who would be the vast majority of everyone
would look at it and think it looks like tax records or your shopping list or something with some numbers in it. So it might have been a way to hide the fact that this was Christian scripture. It might have been. There's opinion is divided on this. I definitely think that's what it is, but that the academic majority opinion is that it's something else. Something like the Hebrew scriptures where they never write God's name, they put something else in. But that doesn't explain why they would do that with David, for example. But they do. Or fathers, and they do.
Great, thanks Tim. That was great, and it sort of reminded me of some textual analysis that was done in the New Testament, the different Gospels, and showing that the variation between them is precisely the amount that you'd expect if they were independent eyewitness accounts, except obviously for Mark's Gospel being referred to directly in others. But yeah, the amount of variation, particularly with the time, when things occurred, was very very true to an authentic set of different eyewitness testimonies. So that may be a comparative, something to have a look at as well. And I was also wondering if there was whether you'd thought of publishing this in, say, ISCAST's journal, COSAC or COPAC as one of the options. Like how have you sort of looked at publishing this in different places? Has it been sort of a bit challenging given the multidisciplinary nature of it?
Academia is fickle and it's got trends and fashions. And the funny thing is, I mentioned the Caesarean text. The field now is universally agreed that the Caesarean text does not exist. But I beg to differ, because it stands out very plainly when you analyse the Gospel of Mark, the variation in the Gospel of Mark. So I'm definitely in a minority. It used to be a minority of one. Now it's a minority of three, because other people have done analysis. So I did something called classical multidimensional scaling and divisive clustering and neighbour joining and something called partitioning around medoids. So I did 4 different techniques, and the Caesarean text drops out in all of them. And there was just silence, because I have published and just had 0 uptake. But a couple of others have now done the analysis using their techniques, non-negative matrix factorisation, and something that's a bit like neighbour joining. Don't worry about the mumbo-jumbo. But they're getting the same kinds of groupings dropping out. And so we've written a joint paper and it's waiting to be published.
I'm wondering if this kind of analysis has been done on other texts, ancient texts, secular ones, or
Yes.
non-Christian texts.
Yes. So someone called Peter Robinson, another Australian who was at Oxford, now in Canada, did this. He actually issued a challenge. So he did a family tree of manuscripts using old school methods. And then he issued a challenge and said, can you come up with some kind of analytical method that gets the same answers? And someone did. And they used a technique that the biologists use. And so there are others who have done this, and in fact did it before. Was it? Yeah, because when I heard about what Peter Robinson did, that was while I was doing my PhD research. I didn't end up using the same technique that came out of his challenge, but it's the same kind of thing. So yes, others. If you do it with Homer, you'll find it, because that would be the next most copied text from the ancient world, and I'm sure you would find the same kind of variation. That's an interesting point. I wonder whether you would see the same centres that you see drop out of this kind of analysis.
I'm also wondering whether nowadays AI could assist this kind of endeavour.
Sure could. Yes, it's a good question. Ask ChatGPT about textual groups in the New Testament, but it'll just regurgitate what's been written. But as far as the analysis goes, if you asked it to write a program to analyse it, it'd have to get back to the Greek, which it might be able to do because there are projects around to transcribe all of the manuscripts. The Institute for New Testament Textual Research in Germany is actually doing that. So if it could get at their texts, it may well be able to come up with something along those lines. It's a good question. It's a good thing to try. I know what the picture will look like.
So was your purpose to test the veracity of the particular scriptures, to convince the unconvinced, or to make sure that what was written is true and so on? In other words, there's more kudos in proving something wrong rather than proving something's right.
Yes. I didn't have a purpose. I did theology, and I found myself drawn to this area. But at the outset, I just wanted to... There was a part to demonstrate the reliability of the text. That was something, but was that my motivation? I think I was just interested in this area, the text of the New Testament. Yeah, so because I did do physics originally, and so I had the science mindset, kind of. I wasn't, like I say, I was bad at it. But yeah, kind of like someone playing on the seashore, like Newton said, just messing about and discovering things, surprised at the discovery side of things. Because these things dropped out. It wasn't like I was seeking to find anything. I just wanted to know what happened, because it's a bit of a headache trying to work out what happened. And I should say at the end, what do you do when you see some manuscripts have, and it's something different? Do you say, well, I can't believe it? Well, like I say, usually it's a variation on a theme. But what I do now is I look at both of them and think that both of these might be what whoever wrote Hebrews wrote. And it's worth looking at both of them, because both have survived also. And so they've been copied intentionally. And yeah, so the variants have survived. But I just know both, and I know that it's hard to tell what would have been written by the apostles in those few, very small percentage of times. One a number, 1% you'd be talking about, where there's a difference that makes a significant meaning in difference, a significant difference in meaning. There's a few, and then I just know what they both say and think, well, it could be either. And what you'll find is that they're, without exception, not saying anything different to something you'll find somewhere else in the New Testament.
So not passed over sins?
Not passed over sins, no. Or the naughty Bible where they printed, you shall commit adultery. Someone got put in prison for that back in the day. And it wasn't a joke, it was a mistake, but they still went to prison.
Excuse me, Tim. Without the help of the software, how many more years do you expect to finish your PhD analysis? Yeah, without the help of the software, if there is no help from the software, from the program.
How long would it have taken?
Yeah.
I did maths at university,
Yeah.
linear algebra, eigenvectors and eigenvalues. And I thought, what's the point of this? What is the use? When will I ever use this? Guess what? Classical multidimensional scaling is doing. It's doing eigenanalysis. But I can't do it. I was really bad at maths. But you put the data in and push the button and the answers come out. So I couldn't have done it without the others. Something else that Isaac Newton said when he said, I'm just like someone who was playing on the seashore, is that we all stand on the shoulders of giants.
Now you have the experience of Hebrews. How about other books? After you finish your PhD, will you keep going with other books?
No. But what I found out is that the critical apparatus in our Greek New Testament is entirely right. I found one place where I thought I'd found a mistake, but like I say, they already knew and it's fixed. And so it's a collaborative project, and there are a lot of eyes on this stuff, and there have been for a very long time. And computers are just making it easier to get at. And the analysis hardware that we've got now, machinery, makes it easier to do the analysis. So these things are just coming out. And what I was surprised at was that the data contains evidence of the historical process of copying. And that's a stamp of authenticity. That's what you can't fake. And it's there. And it's a surprise.
This is not a question, but more about it's comments. To be honest, I don't understand, most of you are studying, PhD in Hebrews. But I'm very excited to see the conclusion, even though so many variations, and we can trust the Bible, authentic of the Bible. That's, for the ordinary Christians, that's what we need. You confirm the truth of the Bible. Yeah,
and it's a message that is not emphasised enough. So Bart Ehrman wrote a book called Misquoting Jesus. It was a New York Times bestseller. And basically says that you can't trust anything that's written in the New Testament. But I don't agree with that. And that was one of my motivations for making my research more widely available by making the software easier for people to use. That was a motivation when I read Bart Ehrman's book, and I thought, that's not true. That's not right. It's overstating the case for people who want to say that it's not reliable. But you've got to compare the New Testament with everything else out there, and it's far and away the most well-founded text from the ancient world. And so that was a motivation for me after I'd found out what I did during the PhD.
Can you give us a few specific comparisons, like you mentioned Homer?
Yes.
So how does the textual evidence for that compare?
30 manuscripts compared with 5,000. No, sorry, 300. 300 manuscripts compared with 5,000. And that is by far the best. And after that, you're talking about 2 or 3 manuscripts. So, Veni Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered, the Gallic Wars, 2 manuscripts. That's all there is. And they're late copies. So, 1,000 years. 1,000 years. So we've got copies of the New Testament fragmentary that go back to 200. Some would date them in the first half of the 2nd century, so somewhere between 100 and 150 for a few of the texts. Again, going by handwriting. It's an inexact science.
I just wanted to add that Graham Finlay used a lot of the same tools, those text analysis tools, but to look at the history of the genome. So he was doing work on the history of different cancers, and you could actually trace where the cancers had come from in your body and looked at how. And he used all of those similar tools that I remember him bringing it up on the computer and showing me. And this is actually what led him down the road of looking at evolution and the history of different species and everything. And in a sense, it showed this history that was kind of in the text, so to say.
Yes.
And the tools are very, very well developed because there literally are, millions of dollars being put into the analysis of this, not for evolution, but mainly for cancer and for diagnosing disease and things. So all of these little textual variations can lead to death in a person. So it's super critical. So those techniques are very, very powerful, and there's actually more and more coming out all the time. So
yes.
And I just wanted to highlight that because Graham Finlay is going to give an upcoming ISCAST talk with which could be quite interesting because he always brings up the textual variations, and he always has the different things and shows how they sort of slot together and everything, and it just reminded me of that. So I just thought it's nice the biologists and the textual.
Well, I have a great debt to the biologists because they developed all of these tools. Numerical taxonomy, it started with them. And that's all I've been doing. It's just taking their stuff and applying it to the New Testament.
Probably should be the last question, I think.
Have the Dead Sea Scrolls formed any part of Christian research in terms of, other than Barbara Thiering and so on? I'm just wondering, the Essenes were seemingly involved in Christian, or in the East, in the origins of Jesus' ministry.
There hasn't been any similar research to what I've been doing and others have been doing with the New Testament for the Old Testament, as far as I know. They've got fewer texts to work with. So there's plenty of copies of the Hebrew Bible, but they tend to be late. And the Dead Sea Scrolls are a separate group to what you get mostly, which is the Masoretic text. But there's such a controlled copying regime with the Hebrew Bible that they won't release a copy that's got, because they're very careful about checking the text. They won't release, in fact, they'll put it into a Geniza, which is a graveyard for manuscripts, because they're too sacred to just throw away. But the interesting thing is there is textual variation, and you find it behind the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible that was made about 200 years before Christ. And there's big old textual variations there. And so it's the same story, but it's different because it's so controlled since 100 AD when the Masoretic tradition first started. And yeah, so you could do this kind of research, but there's very few texts that have any differences in them to do this kind of analysis on. And the problem with the Septuagint is it's a Greek translation, and so you'd have to do a back translation into the Hebrew to compare them, which is problematic.
We ought to wrap up there. Just want to thank you so much, Tim, for a really, really interesting talk and great Q&A time as well. So please let's all give Tim another round of applause.